So I decided to write down a few thoughts about some of the parables that really shaped a lot of my thinking throughout the process of writing my book. In essence, to see what do I think of these things now that I wrote a whole book about it. I think as the ideas pertain to the current moment and the things that are happening in the world, I think that I am largely satisfied with my observations, and I think that the pathway that I was on was right. In some ways, I just see things even more clearly now. To ask the question, what are the problems of the day, or what's behind the problems? What's the cause of the problems? And I think one of the big ones is stupid binaries. And so these stupid binaries, it's not that the things in these stupid binaries are bad. More so, it's that the way we pit them against each other. So I made a list of a few, individualism versus collectivism, agrarianism versus urbanism, technophobia versus technophilia, tradition versus progress, conservatism versus liberalism, and men versus women. So, like I said, it's not that some or all of these categories are fundamentally good or bad, but rather the problem lies in the way that we orient them against their opposites. And I think this is kind of the problem with a culture war mindset versus a mindset of cultivation. Because a culture war has people fighting over control of dead and dying institutions. And the effort spent on capturing or defending these institutions is almost always a misallocation. That energy could be spent better elsewhere in true culture building, which comes from cultivation of people, of ideas, of virtues, whatever. So one of these big divides that the culture war comes across is obviously the divide between conservatives and liberals. And among young people, this is problematic, especially because those categories map very closely along the lines of male and female. And if men and women are in a culture war against each other, that's not going to be good for society, because there won't be a future society if men and women can't figure out ways to reconcile their differences. Rather than thinking of it as men and women, it is looking at it at this divide between conservatism and liberalism. That's kind of the way it's framed, and especially with our political system, due to the nature of our political elections, one group will inevitably be in charge of the other. So for the last 4 years, the liberals were in charge of all the liberals and the conservatives, and now the conservatives are in charge of all the conservatives and the liberals. And how the groups treat each other is crucial to the overall health of the society, regardless of who is in charge. So what I came up with was an idea of two different kinds of dichotomies. So the first is the dichotomy of opposites. And unlike the dichotomy of opposites, which is right versus wrong, black versus white, good and evil, darkness and light, we need to recognize that there is a dichotomy of inversion or reflection, like a mirror. It gives us an opposite that reflects or mirrors the thing that it opposes, rather than in a competitive state. So recognizing the dichotomies of inversion requires more attention to detail. Right and left are not good and evil. Jesus says it's better to pluck out your right eye and cut off your right hand if they cause you to sin. And if anyone was willing to attempt this experiment, hopefully they would come to recognize the connectedness between their right hands and their left hands, because you can't cut off your right hand except by using your left hand to do it.
You have two brain hemispheres.
Yep.
Okay? One controls this hand, one controls this hand. If you want to play something like, let's say when this hand, your brain controls this hand and this hand to meet in coordination, if there's a flexibility in this pick, it's going to be a latency of milliseconds, but
Right.
still,
Yeah.
you know.
So when you hear people say these things like, oh, the left wing and the right wing, it's all part of the same bird, and depending on how they're saying that, if they're saying that in this way as if they stand outside of that paradigm and they're like they discovered the secret way and everybody that's involved in the fight is on a fool's errand, that's not a smart person. Because they're trying to convince themselves that they are disconnected from the problem, but by trying to disconnect yourself from like the problems of society and human culture as it exists is really akin to cutting off your own hand. If you don't participate, you're not gonna be there. So one of the stories that I focused on a lot in the book was the parable of the sheep and the goats. You know, this idea of the sheep and the goats, and Jesus is saying, you gave me something to drink when I was thirsty. You fed me when I was hungry. You clothed me when I was naked, and you gave me a shelter. You welcomed me in. And so I kind of looked at those categories and examined a lot of those things as they pertain to culture. Like, for instance, clothing and nakedness is a very big theme in the Bible, and shelter is very central as far as temple architecture and things like that. So, you know, that's even the kind of the whole theme of the book came from that tents before temples study of the structure of buildings. Okay, so but that is not an isolated story. So that's the thing. It sits in conjunction with two other parables. The first one is the parable of the virgins, which pertains to a scenario more closely aligned with my next book, because I cut out a lot of the stuff about relationships and men and women. It was too much to fit into one book. And then the other one is the parable of the talents, which I did cover quite a bit in my book. And if you try to apply a dichotomy of opposites to each of those parables individually, you can get an answer or a solution, essentially, but when you take them together, you realize that your method of discernment doesn't really work. Look at the parable of the sheep and the goats. You know, the sheep are on the right, the goats are on the left. So the sheep are the good, the goats are the evil. But then if you look at what is asked and required of the people in these different parables and who is clearly pointed to as the good and who is the bad, it really doesn't map clearly. So in the parable of the virgins, there are wise and foolish virgins. And the foolish virgins ask the wise ones for oil. But the wise do not share it. It is the wise virgins who enter into the wedding feast, the ones that don't share with their neighbors who ask. In the parable of the talents, the foolish servant hides the talent to make sure he doesn't lose it. So this is the one that comes after the parable of the virgins. But he is punished for saving the money instead of investing it. So his actions seem to mirror those of the wise virgins, the ones who held on to their oil and guarded it and wouldn't let others have it, but he's the one that's condemned. And then finally, in the parable of the sheep and the goats, the sheep are those who do give to those in need, while the goats are those who did not. And I wanted to compare this to the now infamous liberal versus conservative empathy heat map. And those on the left love the parable of the sheep and the goats because they see themselves as always giving to those who are the least of these. And on the surface, they're probably right in identifying where the conservatives are wrong, because preference for immediate family can cause a purity spiral of exclusion. You know, it's almost like what they've discovered with oxytocin and how it really builds togetherness within a family, within a community, in a marriage, but it at the same time increases the suspicion and the dislike that people have for outsiders. So it's like, well, that's a powerful chemical that can create that social dynamic. So there is something there. If your preference is too much for your most immediate friends and family, it can cause a purity spiral that is too exclusive. But the conservatives point out that the liberals create a purity spiral of inclusion, especially when it is recognized that their preferences towards outsiders are really masking disgust for those on the inner circle, stemming probably from self-loathing. So the difference in the temperaments is actually measuring two different things. One is a scale from preference to indifference. The conservatives prefer those most like them and are indifferent towards those most unlike them, while the other one is measuring an intensity of dislike. So essentially, it's not that the people on the left love all matter in the universe more than they love their neighbors. It's that they are less offended by it, the more distance it has from them. So how can you tell? So look at the parable of the sheep and goats. The goats are surprised to be excluded because they have said the right things, and they have not excluded those with the right labels. They understood that if the Lord appeared in demand of service, they would be responsible to obey, but they did not consider the attitude of the Lord towards the least. They accepted that there was a dichotomy of opposites at play, and then they thought that they could discern the pattern wisely. So in other words, they thought that if they focused on the Lord and what he wants and those who claim to serve the Lord, they could just ignore everybody else. So that's where the conservatives get it wrong, when they are too exclusionary. In contrast, the sheep do not have the right terms or labels, but they are praised for what they do. Then you look up the next one back in the parable of the talents. The foolish servant is similarly punished for a mistaken belief about his understanding of terms. The master entrusts each servant with part of his own wealth according to their abilities. That's what it says. So essentially, he's giving each servant an amount that he is prepared to lose. That's why it's according to their abilities. It's based on what he's prepared for them to lose. And it was a message that said, I trust you this much. And yeah, he trusts the one guy more and the other guy a little less, and the last one the least, but it's still a positive affirmation of trust. He still gave him this gift. But rather than seeing this investment as a sign of his master's trust, the wicked servant equates his master with a tyrant. So he thinks his master's a tyrant, and then he behaves accordingly. In essence, he takes the master's message and says, I don't trust what you say. You said that you're giving me this to invest, but I don't believe you. Because in investment, that's an assumption of risk, and I don't believe that you will forgive me if I risk it and lose it. That's what he's saying. So he treats an opportunity as a punishment. Now this is this burden that he has this thing, and he has to make sure he doesn't lose it. And what he ends up receiving, a punishment in return. By acting according to the servant's understanding, the master actually remains faithful in his conduct. So he's consistent all the way through. And he wanted the wicked servant to understand the nature of their relationship, which is the nature of his character and his faithfulness as a master. That was worth more than giving mercy to somebody that wouldn't understand the mercy. So that's why he punishes him. So then, why, in the parable of the virgins, why are the wise virgins praised for not sharing their oil with the foolish virgins? Well, the problem arises because all of the virgins fall asleep. But the difference is that the wise virgins prepared for the possibility of their own failure. All 10 had equal access and opportunity to bring the extra oil. And the foolish ones were not the least. They still had the means and the opportunity to acquire more oil, even at the end, because they need to go and buy it. So that assumes that they had money. It's not a lack of money, and it's not a lack of supply of oil. The oil is there. They just need to go and buy it. But they couldn't count on a handout from the wise virgins. And so essentially they run out of time. There's another aspect of this I thought of after too, which is if you look at those three things, the correlation, between the character who represents God and the individual, they're at this corresponding levels of intimacy, basically. In the first one, it's about a bride and a bridegroom. So the more intimacy they had the most responsibility. They had the most opportunity to not mess it up. The servant and the master, he should have known better, but the nature of the relationship is not as intimate. His excuse doesn't hold up, but it's more understandable, I guess you could say. And then with the sheep and the goats, that's the difference between a shepherd, a master, king, and an animal. That's the least intimate. And that's why the grace that he has for the sheep, he has very low expectations about them saying and doing the right things, but he appreciates the action that they do, their character. Whereas the goats, essentially, you could say the goats are the ones who act as if they know the king intimately. They act like the bridegroom or the bride, and they know all the right words, but they've missed the essence of his character. Okay, so if we based our morality on that graphic, either saying like conservative or liberal morality is correct, those on the left would place himself among the sheep, but they would condemn the wise virgins, and they would probably defend the wicked servant because he preserved the wealth. He had the same amount back, so that's fair, and they would see his punishment as unjust. Those on the right would defend the wise virgins, and they would probably defend the rights of the master, but they would also end up defending the goats. This is to say, if you are only applying the logic of conservatism to those three scenarios. And it should be noted that the parable of the sheep and the goats implicitly spells out that it's people being divided, not actually sheep and goats. Because sheep and goats are also not a dichotomy of opposites, like right and wrong. They are a dichotomy of inversion, like left and right. They can graze together, but sheep are sheared separately. So, it's saying that this is the way that people are going to be divided. In a sense, it's going to seem arbitrary, or it's going to seem along some, according to some categorization that's not immediately clear. Like why there's nothing about, in other words, there's nothing about goats and sheep that we should intuitively recognize as sheep are good and goats are evil. It's trying to tell us to look more closely than that. According to the context, you actually need both the sheep and the goats. You need wisdom to withhold your oil and the willingness to accept the risk of investment. So liberal and conservative become simplifying heuristics that obscure the true nature of reality. So how do we deal with these dichotomies of inversion and reflection? I think they have to be mastered through proper integration. So I made a couple other examples of, left and right. You have on the left swords and spears, and on the right plow shares and pruning hooks. It says in the Bible that those can be changed from one to the other, basically indiscriminately. And sometimes you need the one and not the other. Maybe say majority of the time you want what's on the right, but sometimes you need that left-hand thing. Goats and sheep are another one. Another one would be like horses and donkeys. When it has horses are like the wartime animal, and the donkey is the peacetime animal. Looking at this shepherding metaphor, in John 10, Jesus refers to himself as the good shepherd, and he contrasts himself as a shepherd versus a hireling. But hirelings are not evil. A hireling is a wonderful person to have to a certain extent. you can expect them to do the work in the peacetime, but you don't expect them to lay down their life for the sheep like the shepherd does. So even if you think about those three parables, the servants are all hirelings. 2 of them were very good hirelings. 1 of them was a bad hireling. So you can have good hirelings. Would you require of your hireling the same thing that you would require of yourself? No, you don't expect them to live up to the same standard, but it doesn't mean that there is no place for them or that they're not a useful person to have around. And then I even thought of one that's not present literally, but if you think about it in that John 10, he also talks about like why do the hirelings leave? Because a wolf comes and scatters the flock, and they are going to run away from the wolf. So are sheep good and wolves bad? No, not necessarily, because if you think about a kind of left hand, right hand, on the one hand you have the wolf, what's on the other hand? It's the sheepdog. The sheepdog is a wolf that you have brought in and changed his nature and reoriented his message towards the good. When I think about that and looking at like that heat map of the liberals and conservatives and where those lines are, all people in the world, that should be a more important category than like non-human animals. There is something to the idea that your preferences should be perhaps higher towards those whom you are most close to, your natural family, but it shouldn't be at the exclusion of loving those who are outside. If you think about the Good Samaritan, like that's the example. The guy wants to define who his neighbor is so that he can exclude the people he doesn't want to love. And I think this is something where you see how that kind of false compassion comes in. Because let's say the person who's left-leaning will say that they care about those outside of their country more than those within their country. And so they're willing to have people come and immigrate into their country, but they're not actually caring about those people now that they're in the country. They're more so inviting them in for the sake of annoying the people who already live here, the people who are closer to them relationally. And this is where the problems break down, because when people are trying to advocate for these sort of social programs on national scale as a way to integrate, that's not the way. The way is actually going back to the other breakdown between liberals and conservatives, is between men and women. And when you look at the theme about this stranger in the Bible, it's not about inviting whole groups of people with a totally different culture, whose culture might be antithetical to your own, and just letting them do their culture that's eventually going to want to destroy you. No, you actually have to get involved with their lives. And, that might be reaching out and actually sharing a meal with the person that lives next door to you, who's from a different culture. Or in the biblical term, a lot of times what it is it's the wife. The wife comes from the person who's a foreigner. And that's the way that they're integrated in. And so that is, that's the right way to do it, rather than the left way to do it, I guess you could say. And which is also to say why when you hear people spiraling towards exclusion on racial categories, that's really bad. It's really a good thing that our vice president is married to an Indian woman and they love each other. There's nothing wrong with that. People that are saying like that's a weird compromise or something like that, it's really not. It's actually very much a part of the biblical ideal. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to always marry someone who doesn't look like you. There's enough difference between man and woman that any marriage is going to provide you the opportunity to love your neighbor, or love your enemy even, I would say, in a meaningful way. But there is actually something very compelling about the fact that a man and a woman on a human level can connect, and it transcends the categories of tribe or nation. So those are some of my thoughts on those parables and this need to look closely at these things that are in opposition and to see, are they really in opposition, or are they just two, a right hand and a left hand reflecting each other? Is it a mirror image? And figuring out how to integrate those dichotomies in our world. So if you have any thoughts, please leave a comment. Thank you for watching.